everyone, and welcome back to Anecdotal Evidence. This is the last episode in our anthology of collected stories and conversations. And this episode is just going to be me reflecting on what I've learned from this experience and an opportunity to thank everyone for their participation in this project. It's kind of hard to believe it's drawn to a close because as an idea, it still feels very fresh. Today's New Year's Eve, 2016, heading into 2017. And the idea for this podcast came about a little over 2 years ago. It was shortly after my father passed, and I was reflecting on one of our last conversations in which he was sharing his personal experience about how he was very sure that taking statins, cholesterol-lowering drugs, which he took for several years for treatment of congestive heart failure, and he was very sure that taking these pharmaceuticals shortened his life, weakened his condition. And he shared that with me towards the end of his life. And of course, it had a profound impact on me as a physician. And I had been questioning our approach to Western medicine for many years before this, and had a private practice that was already related to or focused on helping people who felt that they may be stuck on particular psychiatric medications and finding a pathway to get unstuck or to safely taper and withdraw from these medications in certain conditions if that was their wish. And so I'd been working with folks, helping them on that path, and had been learning a great deal just from opening my mind to those possibilities. But when my dad had this conversation with me, I was thinking, how can I share this message? And it's not a message of the danger of statins, which is for another conversation. But the message was, where does real teaching from human stories have a place? And that's in part how I came about the name Anecdotal Evidence. The power of sharing stories and sharing conversation and seeing what we can come up with in community of human beings when we put our minds together and address, what is life? What is health? Where is the healing path? How do we find it when we're confused? How do we sort through all the information that's out there? And the term anecdotal evidence is one that is derogatory in Western medicine. It's meant as a dismissive term. As soon as something's labeled anecdotal evidence, the idea behind it is that it's non-prescriptive information, not useful for other individuals because their situation is not necessarily, or it's actually by definition, going to be different from the particulars of one person's story, one person's anecdote. So, in Western medicine, the term anecdotal evidence is meant to indicate one that should not be prescriptive. And yet, in psychiatry, as much of the currency of the work comes in conversation and sharing. This is also where psychotherapy or talk therapy finds its place, is how can we use these narratives to find their therapeutic value as we're crafting them, in the midst of crafting them, in the midst of telling our story. How do we learn from it? So in November of 2014, I set out to see what I could learn, to see who would talk to me and share on record their personal story and their personal experience. And as you can imagine, and as you can see from looking back on the previous episodes, it's been quite a bit of collected information, and I want to take some time to thank these guests, because there's been so many great guests on this show, and I've learned so much from each of them. And I hope you have as well. I definitely encourage, if you're interested in this and you have found some of these episodes interesting, I encourage you to check any of them out. Order off the menu, so to speak. Download the one of your interest, because I think there's a lot to each of these stories, to say the least. But it began with my first conversation with Bob Bowman, Dr. Robert Bowman, an emergency department physician who transitioned his healing practice from working within the institutional confines of Western medicine to the wide open space of yoga, where he served as a yoga teacher. And that's been a particular inspiration for me, because when yoga entered my life, it changed it profoundly. And I want to thank Bob for courageously stepping forward as the first guest. And it was a very symbolic opening to the podcast, from physician to yoga teacher. Not that I'm a yoga teacher now, but it was a recognition that there is so much beyond what we're taught in medical school as to where the healing path is. And so it was a jump-off point for further conversations. And my next guest was Daniel Nevins, who is an artist who paints abstract paintings of depth and wonder, as well as representational paintings. He recently depicted the Torah in a series of paintings. And what's interesting about Daniel, amongst many things, if you can ever get a conversation with this guy, he's not just entertaining, but mesmerizing almost in his wisdom and his own curiosity, is that he's also transitioning his practice as he's moving into the healing arts directly. And so I wish him well in his journey to serve as a psychotherapist, as a counselor. And he was my second guest. And my third guest was the physician Brian Lewis, who I went to med school with and now practice with here in Asheville. He's got his own practice at Integrative Family Medicine of Asheville. And he shared his journey of exploration and learning in his experience with yoga, and how he was able to unlock frontiers of the mind through a very rigorous meditation practice. Really speaks to the power of what we can unlock internally through disciplined meditation. And also the importance of having an external outlet to be able to process what comes up from these experiences and to share it, so that we don't just plunge into the inward abyss. Very interesting conversation. Thank you, Brian, for sharing that. And it was really great to be able to get to know him a little bit better. My fourth guest was Corey Costanzo, who is multi-talented. He practices the healing arts as an Esalen-trained massage therapist, a somatic therapist, a somatic experience therapist, but he also plays the didgeridoo and teaches yoga with his wife, and has a really great practice that opened across the street from where my private practice was, called Still Point Wellness, and he's done real well with that and has established it as a great healing center here in Asheville, and I really enjoyed getting a chance to meet him. And then I met Ryan Kirkzak, who is also an immensely talented individual. He practices as an astrologer, a Vedic astrologer. He's also a Kriya Yoga teacher and a meditation coach. And he's a lifelong scholar and ambitious teacher. I mean, he has so many YouTube videos that he posts, and I've watched many of these, and you can really immerse yourself in some deep learning on the nature of Kriya Yoga and astrology and how it all starts to fit together when you are able to clear your mind and take a step back and look at things. And it's been such a blessing to be able to be exposed to his teachings and to get a chance to meet him and sit down with him for a while. It's funny, like this process has helped me meet all these people who I consider friends, and yet, life is busy and it's hard keeping up with folks. So just going through this list, it makes me miss the people on here. And then my next guest was Brack Jeffries, who I came to hear about from going to a week-long conference on holotropic breath work, where I was introduced to the practice of holotropic breath work, which was developed by Stanislav Grof, the eminent psychiatrist, and his wife Christina Grof. And Brack is an advanced practitioner and leader of holotropic breath work, and I was told I had to meet him. And eventually our paths did cross here in Asheville, and I'm very thankful to have met him. And we've kept in touch a little bit. He has a new venture, the Center for Spiritual Emergence, and I think he's just a remarkable individual, a deep healer. And it was great having a conversation with him. We're from the same area of North Carolina, and we were able to brainstorm about what healing ventures may look like. And then my next guest was the Ayurveda practitioner, Vishnu Das. And what a treat that was. He really went into depth with his life story, in particular his travels in India, and how he came about the practice of Ayurveda. And he's been at it for a long time now, well established here in Asheville through his practice, Blue Lotus. And he was the main teacher for my wife Brooke's Ayurveda wellness curriculum at the Asheville School of Massage and Yoga. So it was a real privilege and a treat to be able to sit down with him and just talk about Ayurveda and to appreciate what he shared about how it's a complementary form of medicine. It doesn't supersede any other form, but it has a comprehensiveness about it. Everything is connected, and the more you explore your own life through the Ayurveda prism, the Ayurveda model, it helps for self-understanding and finding out what's good for us and what isn't, and how to apply that in our own lives in a very simple way, but also a vastly complex way. Ayurveda is the science of life, and it's the oldest science in human history. So that really marked a jump-off point or a new immersion in Ayurvedic teachings, and that's opened my mind to this vast world, and it's been a great inspiration. And so I just want to say thanks, Vishnu. And also thanks to Cricket Greer, who works with Vishnu and is a practitioner in her own right in different forms of therapy, movement therapy, as well as talk therapy. She has a diverse background, and being able to meet her and hear from her experience, how her life story influenced her finding work in the healing arts. It's just a real joy to be able to meet her and converse with her. And then I also had the opportunity to talk with Eddie LeSure, who is a seasoned meditation coach And what was really interesting about his episode was he shared his personal view from living inside the Attica prison during the Attica prison riots. And of course, that was a shocking event and can very rightfully be called a traumatic event, as it was on him. I mean, he was right there in the midst of it. And Attica's been reinvestigated recently as the 45th year, some anniversary has passed for this. There was a new book out on it, so it was very interesting, the timing of it all, being able to learn about this as it's re-entered the national conversation. But Eddie's just a great guy and a great meditation coach, and he has his own radio program on WPVM called A Mindful Emergence, which is the name of his practice here in Asheville. And so he's another friend who I've gotten to meet through this podcast. And in that same crew, I got to meet Stephen Martin, who we were able to talk about healing and that process from his experience as a physicist. You know, and an astronomer. It's interesting how folks who meditate on the cosmos and what's out there in the stars and beyond, it stimulates our interest as to what's inside of us. How do we fit in with this incredibly vast cosmos? And he's done a lot of exploration of this over the years, and he has his own book, which is a fantastic read, called Cosmic Conversations. Highly recommend it. He was able to talk to many great thinkers across different disciplines, and that was how I framed our conversation, just a cosmic conversation. And I just really appreciated the chance to meet him, and I look forward to sharing with him more in the future. And I also had the opportunity to interview one of my yoga teachers, Louis Rothline. And Louis is someone I haven't seen much of lately as I've gotten kind of busy, but I look forward in 2017 to going to more of his classes if I'm able to, because he's a wonderful Ashtanga yoga teacher. Very warm and welcoming, and just a great teacher of students of all levels, from the earliest beginners to advanced yogis. And he's a senior and seasoned Ashtanga teacher, and it was a real joy to be able to sit down with him and to hear about his life experience and to pick his brain, so to speak, for a little bit. And then at the start of the new year, I was able to have 2 conversations with ministers, Caroline Proctor and Brian Combs. And this was informational and educational for me to be able to hear a ministerial perspective to what healing means and what spiritual healing may be about. And this theme came up in a variety of conversations. I'll get into it a little bit more later, but it was really great to meet the both of them and to spend some time exploring their perspective on health and healing and relationship and faith and how it fits together for each of them. And Caroline is a practitioner of Chinese medicine and acupuncture, so she's able to see the human condition, illness and wellness from 2 different and diverse backgrounds and to integrate those in her life and practice. So this has been all part of the learning experience. And continuing that little mini theme on faith, I was able to converse with my neighbor, Rob Wergen. And I highly recommend that episode as well, which we just titled Transformation, because it represents the story that he had from his personal life is a life of suffering in which he was able to experience transformation and liberation, and how he's channeled that experience into working with others in this capacity, into a life in the healing arts. And his work defies the abstract categorization of language. It's a work of experience and energy and faith, and I can't categorize it, but I know that the experience of sitting down and talking with him and listening to him and learning from him was inspirational, and I'm very grateful to Rob for courageously sharing like he did. And I also had the opportunity to meet another local artist, Julian Davis, who is an accomplished and highly respected painter from England, who has made his home in the South and here in Nashville for over 20 years. And his paintings reflect the human condition. It's hard to put visual art into words. It's hard to do it, and it's impossible to do it, but I encourage you to check out his work, because the richness of color and of character in his paintings, it's true, a picture is worth 1,000 words and beyond. And I really appreciate meeting Julian and what he shared in our episode. And from there, the podcast took a little bit of a turn, because Brooke and I took a 2.5-week trip to India this year. And we went with the great teacher, Indu Arora, who is our trip leader. And I'll get back to her in just a second. But while we were in India, we had the most incredible experience. At the risk of sounding redundant, it was, and as India is, it defies being able to be limited into words. You know, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly from seeing what life was like thousands of years ago in states that are relatively unchanged, seeing what religious ardor and total devotion are about, the good and the bad that goes with that, and all the ancient structures and ancient cultures. So I took several episodes to share that trip with you, and I hope those were enjoyable, and check them out if you haven't. But the two in particular that I was most excited about are the two lectures from the teacher Siddhartha Krishna, who we sat in a room with, and he lectured to us about an hour, a little over an hour each, and he introduced us to his work as a lifelong scholar of the Vedas and how it is relevant to our life today. And there's an eloquence and a depth to his teachings which you can only experience from listening to them. So it was great being able to meet Siddhartha Krishna and his father, and that's a memory I'm going to treasure the rest of my life. And there's one story which I haven't shared with you yet, and I guess this is the real gift of this episode. But that was an experience that Brooke and I had when part of our trip, we went to a cave outside of Rishikesh. And it's a cave that yogis have been meditating in for thousands of years. And we had the good fortune of being able to take a little time to meditate in this cave and just experience what these yogis have experienced in a very, 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 very small dose, a small portion of it. But that, just to describe it, it's a cave that tourists come to, and you kind of shuffle in and out, and there's cell phone camera lights on as people are shuffling in and out, and you hear people moving about. And, as the world is full of curious people now and curious tourists, places of interest are popular. And so, there was maybe 20 other people with us in this cave, and there's enough room for everyone, and they schedule it so people can get in and out. And I had about a 30-minute meditation in there, and I felt clear and refreshed from the experience. And it's one of those things you can't put into words, but in coming out of this cave, which is on the banks of the river Ganges, the most sacred river in India, I was walking out on the rocks of the beach of the river there, and I was looking for Brooke, trying to catch up with her because she had left earlier. And she walked out to do some meditating in a more private way than the cave, somewhat ironically, but this is just one of those things that you can't put into words. But Brooke was standing on the rocks of the river Ganges, and as I was walking up to her, she turned to me and said, "Saraswati is here." And I didn't know exactly what she meant. I was a little confused from the whole event, and I said, "What?" And she said, "Saraswati is here." And she showed me her phone where she had taken a picture, and there, walking along the river Ganges, was Robin Saraswati Marcus, who just so happened to be one of my guests on the podcast from earlier. So here we are, all the way across the world in India, in a somewhat remote part of India, and we run into one of the guests on the podcast, Anecdotal Evidence, Robin Saraswati Marcus. And so it was just one of those things that, I mean, what are the odds of that? What does it mean to see someone from Asheville, from your hometown, from where you live, all the way across the world? I don't know. And it's just been such a mind-blowing thing. I haven't even had the chance to catch up with Dr. Saraswati about this. Brooke and her exchanged messages, and they both understood, yeah, this is the powerful stuff that we're talking about here. So it was a little miracle. I don't know what it means, but it means something. And it's just one of the little teaching points that have come up where coincidence is transcended and the connectedness that we all share is experienced. So thank you, Dr. Saraswati, for our conversation and what you shared about your practice. And thank you for that cosmic moment that we shared in our own way. I look forward to when our paths cross and we can share this experience with a laugh and a hug and some wonder. Wow. So yeah, that was the little miracle that this podcast brought into my life. It gave me the chance to meet Dr. Saraswati, and then we had that incredibly remotely chance encounter across the world. And from there, came home from India, and a couple months later, I was able to actually sit down for a conversation with Indu Arora, the great yoga teacher and Ayurveda teacher who's from India but now calls Chicago home, and she does teaching all over the country and all over the world. And I had the blessing and the opportunity to have dinner with her and a conversation with her. And she is a powerfully conscious person and a great teacher, a great listener, focused person who has dedicated her life to teaching and sharing and scholarship as well. She's an eminent scholar, but you hear all of that in our conversation. I definitely recommend that episode if you haven't heard it yet, the conversation with Indu Arora. And it felt like a nice segue to go to my conversation with Asheville's meditation coach, Bhante Ujodika Bivamsa, who is a Buddhist monk from Burma, who has been teaching meditation here in Asheville for a number of years and is one of the happiest people you'll ever meet, filled with joy. He radiates it and teaches on the value of simplicity, the necessity for peace of mind in order to find happiness. And that was just one of the blessings this podcast brought me, the opportunity to meet Bhante. And his meditations are open to the public here in Asheville at his meditation center. And he's the living practice of meditation. Wonderful human being. And before I was going to wrap up the podcast, I definitely wanted the opportunity to meet and converse with Dr. Angela Hind, who is the last physician in our anthology, and she does great work in educating about the dangers of toxins in our environment, in our food supply, and in our water, and how we need to raise our awareness to improve the quality of the nutrients and the sustenance that we ingest. It's a very toxic world out there. And she shares how through her work, she was pigeonholed into an area of medicine that was not fully conducive to what she knows healing was about. And so she had to further her studies and advance her practice and break beyond those barriers. And now she does great consulting work and is a teacher and a leader in the field of educating on the dangers of GMOs and the dangers of fluoride dumping and what we can learn from all this and how we can protect ourselves. And she's just a warm and lovely human being, and it's been a real pleasure to meet her. And I look forward to maintaining relationships with her and all these people going forward, including my last guest, the musician Chris Wilhelm. And if you haven't heard any of his music, check it out online. Chris Wilhelm Music, the Wilhelm Brothers. He's got a number of CDs out there. He is a singer-songwriter who is dedicated to living his dream and has done it. And he's done it according to his own principles. It's been very courageous. He finds gigs wherever he can, and he records when he can, and he meditates and writes songs, and he lets that whole spirit and process animate his life. And if you ever get a chance to hear him live, you will thank yourself, because as a performer, his music invites you right in. He makes eye contact with his audience, and all of his stories tell little songs, and they invite you in to be a part of it. And he dedicates so much energy to the craft of songwriting that, you know how a good song is universal. Those are the songs that he writes. And he sings 3 of them at the end of the episode. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine, Long Live Your Tomorrows, and I'll See You in St. Augustine. And those are 3 great songs. And it was a delight and one of the pleasures of this whole experience to be able to be in the room for him to sing them. But moreover, the joy is in sharing it with you. So those are at the end of the episode 27. Chris Wilhelm, Living the Music. And that was a good conclusion to the anthology, in that he shared his healing story of how music has helped him through some hard times, but it just marked a focal point of talking about music, because music is my passion. It's my hobby and my creative outlet. And it's what I hope to dedicate some more time to for my creative output in this life in the future. So one of my goals for next year is to finish up an album that I've been working on in partnership with Jacob Bernowski, who is an individual which I can't summarize his whole life because it's vast, but he was a television personality in the 70s. He did a program called The Ascent of Man, and that's how I discovered him. But before that, he was a great mathematician, eminent and highly respected for his work, and through his analytical mind, he was able to collaborate with the group of scientists that developed the atomic bomb. And after that bomb, those two bombs were detonated in Japan. He went to Nagasaki to help with the cleanup, and he was able to see and experience the devastation that was caused when the human mind is co-opted for forces that are evil, that's about destruction and death and warfare, and it changed his life. He dedicated his life from then on to the spirit of life, the study of life, how we've been able to understand life and what it's about, the study of biology, how it's evolved over the years. And that program, The Ascent of Man, was very popular in the 70s. It came out in 1973, the year I was born. And he passed the following year. It's the work of a lifetime, but he also wrote many books and was involved in as a radio personality and television personality and other projects. And he said that his work was worth studying, and he was a person worth listening to because he lived his life full of heart and full of mind. And I think that's a simple summation of what we're all after. We're after a greater presence in our own mind, in our own lives, and about living our lives with a full heart to share with others, to participate in others' healing and the growth, because we have so much work to do. So as I was inspired by The Ascent of Man, I've been at work for the past couple years on an album, which is a collaborative album with Jacob Bernowski's words, and I've supplied some music to accompany them and to accent some passages from The Ascent of Man, which I think are worth sharing and hopefully will spark others' interest into going deeper with Jacob Bernowski's work. So I've been publishing my work under the name Sloan Wolf, and that's my musical moniker. And so look for this collaborative album to be released in 2017 as I finish it and complete it. And I think that's going to mark a transition point from this work and anecdotal evidence into what's to come from beyond. So some other reflections I'd like to share here at the end is that, as 2016 is drawing to a close in the year of fake news, misinformation, we all suffer from a deterioration of communication. The way we communicate with each other, the way we share, is suffering. There's a lot of talk out there about how we're more connected and how social media helps to connect us. But as many of us know and talk about and share, we know that it only divides us unless we're able to use that to get to the real communication, the real sharing, the real connection. And we have not figured that out yet by any means. In fact, it's deteriorated and is under threat. Not just threat from hackers, which is real, hacking elections and hacking democracy, which sounds like it may have been real, but also hacking into our emotional reactionary abilities, our primitive reptilian brain activation, which can be triggered. And as people have learned how to trigger these primitive emotions and to use them for nefarious purposes, we are suffering as a species. And so one of the reasons I've chosen to draw the podcast to a close is that it takes time to do this. I love podcasts. Mark Maron was my main inspiration for starting my own podcast, and I'm still going to listen to him. And of course, I hope as many of you listen to this podcast and share these episodes with each other, because these guests have a lot to share, and there's some really good stuff in there. But in terms of my interest, I've met a number of people, and I've learned from a number of people in these conversations, and I think it's time to reflect on what I've learned, and rather just continuing that single person meeting, single conversation, sharing, but to learn a little more in depth from the human connection, to get to know the people in my life that I already know better, and to save room for the real human relationships that are to come. Because putting this podcast together takes a lot of time. There's a lot of time staring at computer screens and fiddling around with AV equipment, scheduling, booking, yada, yada. And it's all worth it. It all has been totally worth it, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But I'm hoping to refine my focus for 2017 and the foreseeable future to the dedication into real heartfelt communication, one-on-one with each person that crosses my path, with every human I meet. Each one of them is a teacher for me and has something to share with me. And at the same time, I feel like it's my responsibility to give back and to share in my own little way. So that's kind of vague, but what I'm getting at is that in the time to come, I'm setting my clear intent for 2017 to enrich the quality of interpersonal human interaction and stepping away from some of the technological confines. And so that's the idea behind closing this anthology, completing this collection, and letting it stand alone. It's sad to step aside from something like this. There is emotion, there's a loss. And it may not be the last podcast I ever do, or the last time I talk into a microphone addressing an invisible audience. But it's going to be the last for a while. And one of the sadnesses is I've really enjoyed working with my creative consultant, Brian Mashburn. And he is half of the podcast, to say the least. He hasn't spoken on air at all, and he prefers to work behind the scenes, but he is an incredibly talented visual artist. Please check out brianmashburnart.com to see his work. Brian's been a friend of mine for a number of years. We have an interesting connection in that when he was a 14-year-old, I coached a basketball team, very poorly, I should add. Brian, I guess, didn't go on to pro basketball career, and I had probably no business coaching basketball. But it was youth rec league basketball when I was a student at Davidson College, and it was 10 years later, or 15 years later, really, that we reconnected here in Asheville, and I recognized his name, Brian Mashburn, from the team. I heard about him as an artist from my friend Stuart, who reconnected us. And since then, we've been good friends, and he has put forth so much time and energy to this podcast, to editing the episodes and getting them right, and to guiding me as to what a listener is looking for, what a listener wants to hear. And I'll say that if I had followed all of Brian's advice, this podcast would probably have a lot more listeners and would probably be a lot more popular. But I did the best I could with it. And I'm just grateful for the experience we had. We would sit and have 3-hour breakfasts on weekends and talk about the episodes to come and the guests and the format and what we needed to work on and how we wanted to present them. You know, he designed all of our episode covers. So all those beautiful anecdotal evidence episode covers were designed and created by Brian Mashburn. So I just want to thank him for his great work and encourage the listeners to check out his art. He really pours his life into his painting. The detail is incredible, and it's out there. So check it out. So thank you, Brian. And thanks to Brooke as well, my wife and partner, for all that she's done to inspire this podcast. She sat in on several episodes with me and helped me in the process and helped encourage me when I was getting scared or nervous or frustrated, and it wouldn't be here without her. So thank you, Brooke. And also thank you, of course, to the guests who I've mentioned. Please check these folks out. They really poured their heart out with what they shared and took a risk in sharing in a public endeavor these stories of vulnerability, but stories of healing. And I know from many of you I've gotten feedback from about the inspiring nature of what they shared. So thank you to the guests. And thank you to you, the listeners, for taking the time out of your busy life to tune into this podcast, for choosing this podcast amongst the sea of noise, amongst the multitude of other ways that you could tune in for your time. I hope that this has fulfilled your hopes in listening to this, and that you were able to take a little bit of inspiration from each of these episodes. Feel free to send me an email, anecdotalevidence@danieljohnsonmd.com, with any feedback or anything you'd like to share from this process. It's been a joy and a privilege to be able to have gone through this. And so as we wrap up here in the last hours of 2016, I wish you well. A Happy New Year in 2017. Take good care. Raise your awareness. And I want to leave you with this quote from Indu Aurora. Thanks, everyone. This is Daniel Johnson, MD. Take care. Was there anything that you would like to add in closing other than what you've said?
Wake up.
Yes.